Hey, what's going on, y'all? Eric Moser here with Covert Conversations. Thanks for joining me today. On this episode, we're going in somewhat of a different direction. Those of you who follow me on social media know that I've been wanting to branch out and discuss different topics, not just policing. I will continue to discuss those issues, but I wanted to dig into issues that I feel like would be beneficial, would be of a greater value, more beneficial for the body of believers, and for those of you who follow me who have more of a conservative mindset. So in this episode, we're going to be discussing the issues related to social justice, maybe a social justice 101 for lack of a better term. So I brought on a good friend of mine. I've had the privilege of appearing on his podcast a couple of times. Mr. Jon Harris from the Conversations That Matter podcast. Welcome aboard, John. Thanks for joining me today, bro.
Thank you, Eric. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be on with you. And I know I think, done 2 episodes together on 2 different police altercations or situations, and you're very
Yes,
helpful
sir.
in that regard. And I appreciate it's an honor to be on with your new podcast.
Yeah, especially you can always know if this thing blows up, you'll know that you were my inaugural guest on the new path I'm heading down.
Oh, I didn't know it was the inaugural. Okay, that's even
Well,
more of an honor. Wow.
yeah, you're the first guy, man. You're the first
Okay.
one I was able to set up with as far as just broadening things beyond police related interactions. You're
You get
the
famous,
guy,
I'll
man.
take credit for it then.
Hey, take all the credit you want. Just tell us a little bit more about you. Who is Jon Harris, and a little bit about your background and what ultimately motivated you to start the Conversations That Matter broadcast podcast.
Yeah. So, we were talking before we started recording, Eric, about your life and how you're into fitness, and you have interest in creation science and apologetics and all these different areas. But you're kind of known for, so far, at least your online presence is policing. And
Yeah.
I think it's similar for me. I have a lot of varied interests and things I'm involved in as well. But my online presence and what I've written on in books and done podcasts on over the last few years primarily is related to social justice, particularly in evangelical circles. So who is Jon Harris? I mean, many things, I suppose, but, um, you know, like you have hobbies in fitness. I also enjoy fitness. I do a lot of hiking. I have, there's a club near me called the Catskill 3500 Club, and you climb all the peaks in the Catskill range that are over 3,500 feet. So I'm a member of
Oh,
that,
wow.
and I'm doing it over again this year in the winter. So you have to go up there when it's ice and snow. And so I enjoy that kind of thing. Not everyone
Yeah.
does, but hunting, fishing, cycling. I got into cycling this year, started to get into rock climbing. So I love all the outdoor stuff.
Very cool.
And
Have you gotten into cycling like on the James White level, like doing 100-mile races or anything like that? Or
I've thought, it's funny you mentioned him because the thoughts crossed my mind to reach out to him before and just see kind of what races he's involved in, and maybe it'd be cool to do one together.
yeah.
I just started this year, and before I do that, I want to make sure that I'm really good first. I don't want to just get dusted by someone who's much older than me. And I'm
Right.
pretty sure right now he would do that. So um, I'm not quite there, but I would love to do competitive cycling in the
Oh,
future.
nice.
Other than that, just I'm involved with my church. I do discipleship. I work with a culinary institute. It's a college ministry, and I'm the minister of music. And so I enjoy that. And when it comes to what I'm known for, I started the Conversations That Matter podcast in, I guess, late 2018, I think.
Hmm.
And was a recent graduate from Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. At the time, I was enrolled in the history program at Liberty University. And I just wanted to have an outlet for talking about things that kind of like you're doing here,
Yeah.
I thought were important and concerning. And I started one of my first episodes was on my experience at Southeastern, and it kind of went mini viral. And I thought, wow, there's a lot of people that are also concerned about social justice. I guess I'll take a few more weeks and I'll talk about it some more. And I did. And the rest is history. I mean, that's what kind of built my platform. And
Right.
I didn't realize it at the time, but there was a lot of demand for someone who was Christian to explain what was happening in Christian
Hmm.
institutions. And there weren't a lot of people that were doing it. or
Right.
had a handle on it. And I had a little piece of the pie being at Southeastern, but then I was at Liberty and I was seeing what was happening there. And I also had the benefit of, I went to a secular university and I had Marxist professors before coming to seminary. And so I knew a little bit about Marxism, enough to recognize that that's what was going on. And
Mm-hmm.
I just started doing more research. I even changed my whole plan as far as my thesis in my graduate program at Liberty. And instead of focusing on, I don't know what I was going to focus on before, I was toying around with a number of things. One was the Dutch history of New York, and I
Oh.
decided to instead, yeah, no one would read it, but I instead decided to write on social justice and a history of
Gotcha.
how it got into evangelical circles. And that became, I reconfigured some things, I added some things, but that became Social Justice Goes to Church. I published that in 2019. And then in 2021, I published, or 2020, I can't remember now, I published Christianity and Social Justice, Religions and
Yeah.
Conflict. And I'm continuing to do research on this particular topic. And it's been fun in a way. I mean, it's had its challenges, but I've been able to travel and speak at churches and get to know some people and help people, and uh, I just find it very rewarding.
Very cool. Very cool. And I have both of those books. I bought them, but I'm like the worst person in the world when it comes down to finishing books, because one of my goals this year is to really get a good grasp of everything related to social justice, critical race theory, all those topics. I want to really become well versed in those issues. So I have a reading list, about 5 books that I plan on reading, and two of those are yours, that to
Oh, well, I'm
really help
honored.
me become. Hey, man, I've been a follower of your show, your podcast, in particularly your YouTube channel, for probably at least 2 years. I would say probably longer than that. And man, you just provided a wealth of information for me, and I've shared your content pretty consistently. So I definitely consider you a very solid source of information. So that was one thing I wanted to go into. It was an additional question that popped into my head while you were telling us a little bit more about yourself, because I noticed that on some of your podcasts, on some of your episodes, you've dug into history a lot. Is that where your degree field lies?
Yeah, I have an undergrad degree in history and bachelor's, and then I have a master's in history as well.
Oh, wow.
In an undergrad, you don't really have a focus. When you get to the grad level, and then of course, if you're PhD level, then you definitely have a focus. So I would be considered. They called it being an Americanist, which means I just happen to study American history more than European. And I guess your thesis is where you would be an expert. So because I studied social justice and evangelicalism, that's where the majority of my focus was. But I consider myself to just be someone who's interested in history. I think for me, early American history, Civil War history, World War II history
Hmm.
have always, I'm a guy, right? So the wars are always,
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
my brother used to ask people when we were kids, he'd ask people what their favorite war was. And it's like, his favorite, we don't like war. What are you talking about? But,
Right.
I had 2 brothers. And so, of course, growing up, we were constantly watching war movies and reenacting them and all of that. So
You
I think that's
never
where it started.
Gotcha. You never had any desires to go into the military, or has any of your family members went that route at all?
My grandfather fought in World War II. I
Oh,
have an uncle who went to Vietnam, and I'm trying to think. I mean, I have some second cousins in the military, but I did consider it at one time. The problem for me was health issues. One of the reasons, actually, I'm into the fitness stuff, not to the degree you are, but I am like, I consistently go to the gym and I run or cycle or whatever, is because I have
right.
asthma, and I grew up with severe asthma. And one of the ways that I've been able to overcome that was by exercising. And so, for me, going to the military wasn't a great option because now I think the standards have relaxed to the point I probably
Oh my
could
God.
join. But
Anybody can join these
yeah,
days.
at the time we were still fighting the war on terrorism. And I talked to recruiters, and they would just kind of not give me a second look when I told them I had asthma. So
Mm.
That's why, but it's a good question. I probably would have been in the military if I was in better health.
Right, right. That was something I battled with when I was younger. A lot of people look at me now. I mean, I'm not like some super stud athlete by any stretch of the imagination. Like I
Might
ran a
be.
10K last year, and that's the furthest I've ran in years, and that was like a big deal. My major goal was to do a half marathon, but I ended up having like a little hip injury that kind of slowed me down my running, so I had to resort to doing more the stair climber and
Oh
rower, the
yeah.
elliptical machine, and different things to kind of keep my cardio up. But yeah, man. But back when I was a kid, I was very sickly. I was sick all the time. I
No
mean,
way, really.
I had asthma. I had a bout where I stayed in the hospital for 2 months because I had some. I don't even know what happened, but it got to the point. It was probably a nutritional deficiency or something like that, where one of my eyes just wouldn't act, like I just went cross-eyed out of nowhere. I mean, it's crazy, but I just went cross-eyed out of nowhere after having ear surgery. And
Wow.
they were talking about taking a bone out of my head, and they gave me electric shock treatment. Now, granted, I'm 52, about to be 53, so we're talking about like 1978 or so. They were giving me electric shock treatment, trying to treat it. It was pretty horrific. And my mom literally, it was like a movie. My mom literally grabbed me and told me to get dressed, and tried to leave the hospital with me. And they were like, "You're not leaving here with your son. You can't leave." And she said, and, she wasn't saved back then. Before she passed, she was definitely born again. So she threw some pretty colorful language at the time back to those nurses, and she pretty much escaped the hospital. Like we were running down the street. She was trying to get away from them because they called the police, and it's a really wild story, man. But
Well, what happened though? You rectified the situation somehow, and it wasn't
well,
through electric
ultimately,
shock.
yeah, ultimately, I don't. They convinced her to bring me back to the hospital. We made it all the way home. They convinced her to bring me back to the hospital, and then eventually it just went away. I was too young to even realize what happened, or what fixed it. If they were even able to fix it, maybe it was just something that happened that was just a temporary thing. But eventually, it stopped. I was able to see normal again. It's just really wild, man. But anyway, like I said, that's a story for another day. But it just goes to show that if you looked at me when I was a kid, you probably never would have thought that I would end up being a soldier, or a cop, and this guy is all in to take care of his health and all that kind of stuff. Because man, I was a mess, and asthma was something I dealt with for a long time. But eventually, I just grew out of it. By the grace of God, it was just something that I just stopped suffering with. So.
Well, I was inspired, speaking of history, and this is the connection maybe between that and fitness, by Teddy Roosevelt, because Teddy Roosevelt
Yes.
also had asthma as a child. And when I was in junior high, I did a paper on him, and I came to learn that. And he made his own gym, and then he basically worked out to conquer the asthma. And I thought, well, maybe if he did it, I could do it. And so I don't know that I'd agree with all his political policies necessarily, but on that
Right.
particular issue, I became an admirer of him, and that's kind of what propelled me into trying to run and all of that. And so anyway, I don't know how we got
That's
off
very
that,
cool.
but
Very cool.
yeah.
Well, just talking about life and just talking about just getting to know you, finding out a little bit more about you and your background. So I'm definitely cool with all that. But I want to respect your time. So let's get back into the main meat of why I actually had you come on today. And I know it's a pretty broad topic, but do with it what you will. I'm just going to throw it out there. What is social justice? And I would say when I ask that question, I ask, what is it in reality, and what is it as far as how the general public basically sees it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So social justice could also be termed redistributive justice, and you'd be accurate because the concept really predates the term. The term became popular at the turn of the century in the United States, really because of people who went to England and admired Fabian socialism and wanted to bring that to the United States. And people in the United States at the time, primarily people who viewed themselves as Christians, did not accept socialism. They thought it was pagan. They thought it was atheistic. And so getting a religious population to adopt that just wasn't an option. And
Let me jump in real quick. When you said Fabian social justice, could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I'm about to,
let's say, yeah. Okay. Do your thing.
Yeah.
Bro.
So probably one of the most popular names would be Walter Rauschenbusch, who also is credited with developing the social gospel. But he went to England and became enamored with Fabian socialism and came back. And he used the term social justice quite a bit to describe what he believed was the correct approach to, I guess, politics and society. And Fabian socialism, so it's basically an Americanized Fabian socialism. Fabian socialism is socialism by degrees. So instead of a revolution like Marx said was inevitable,
Right.
this would be more a gradual process. So Fabian socialists are also called progressives. They don't mind taking time to reach their goals. They don't have to get it immediately.
Much like we see today in the political arena, would you say?
Well, we have some real revolutionaries today who seem very demanding. The hard left wants their revolution now, and they're very immediatist on that. And there's always been people like that. But yeah, I would say a lot of those in the upper echelons, they're going with the flow and they're strategizing and they're taking their time, and they're Gramsci. Gramsci's credited with Gramsci is credited with the term cultural Marxism. And then in the Frankfurt School, these are all different iterations of socialism. You have Marcuse, and Marcuse is the one that's credited with this phrase called the Long March to the Institutions. You've probably heard that. Mm-hmm. And so people will say that Gramsci and then Marcuse initiated this direction that progressives have taken in the United States, where they gain influence in a certain field like education, let's say. And once they conquer education, then they move on to the next thing, and they'll conquer entertainment, and then they'll conquer religion, which is really the process we're in now. It was the last pillar to fall, and it's in the middle of falling. So Fabian socialists are okay with gradually reaching their goals. But to answer your initial question, which very simply, social justice and what it is, social justice, I trace it back to the French Revolution, Jean-Jacques Rousseau being the philosopher of the French Revolution. And he believed in three primary things. And I think you're going to see this in every iteration of social justice, even the ones we've talked about, whether it's Fabian socialism or whether it's, liberation theology or BLM or any of these things. What you'll find are these three components. Number one, the idea that that we should have some kind of a egalitarian equality. And if we don't have that, then things are fundamentally unjust. And what I mean by egalitarian, that's the French word for equality. It really just means equality of outcome, that everyone is going to have the same amount of stuff, the same amount of influence, the same amount of privilege, and no one has an advantage over anyone else. Everyone has the same political voice. And so in order to get there, though, we have a problem. This is the second pillar, or the second component. The problem is that there's all these institutions preventing that from taking place. So you have the church, you have the family, you have business relationships, you have all kinds of things that are hierarchies that are preventing equality from truly taking place.
Legal system.
What's that?
The legal system?
Yeah, sure. The legal system would be part of that. Yeah, I mean, I think probably the legal system has been targeted more than almost anything else in the last few years for being a place where there's all this injustice and disparity. And then in order to challenge these institutions that are preventing equality, we have to create, this is the third aspect of social justice, we have to inevitably come up with some kind of a totalitarian regime or a central authority that's powerful enough to crush all these unfair institutions. And so in our context, that looks like the government, the national or the general government comes in and says, hey, you local police departments, you're not obeying the rules, you're being bigoted. We're going to come in and we're going to take over because we can be trusted with ensuring equality is maintained. And so more and more power is ceded to the general government or the central authority. And that authority becomes the policeman or the grand policeman that makes sure that everything's equal in all these other institutions. Now, the irony of the whole thing is that if the whole problem is that disparities exist between people or people and institutions, the whole logic behind social justice is to create the biggest disparity the world's ever known, an all-powerful, almost godlike central authority versus an individual, and get rid of all the mediating voluntary associations, so forth.
Right.
And so you actually create a big disparity in the name of trying to eliminate disparities. So the whole thing kind of undercuts itself. But that's in a nutshell what social justice is. And every iteration, whether it's BLM or the climate justice or the Me Too movement, you're going to find the same three things come out there, and there's going to be different villains and different heroes, and different. You can assign different labels, but it's going to be the same basic framework.
Wow. So, man, there was a lot right there, man. I mean, like you answered probably half my questions already just with that breakdown. But in your response, it just opened the door for a lot of other things. One of the last things you said was it kind of creates like this godlike structure. And I pretty much kind of already know the answer to this just based on what I've learned over the years. I haven't done a deep dive, but some of the readings I've done on Karl Marx, where would the idea, and I probably already know, like I said, the answer, but where does the idea of God fit in, if at all, with a lot of these people, with advocates for social justice, especially its founders?
Yeah, well, it's fundamentally it's not a Christian idea. It's Francis Schaeffer called Marxism a Christian heresy. So you can see certain parallels. Some people call it an Augustinian framework, but there's this idea that there's a fallenness. So in social justice, it's some kind of oppression, whether it's being a male or being white or being straight, or there's these qualities that exist in the world that are oppression indicators. And so they have an original sin concept, and they have a born again experience. They call it now getting woke, but they're just being kind of awakened to all the disparities that exist. And then the heaven that they seek is equity, diversity, inclusion on this side of heaven, actually in this earth, because they don't believe in the afterlife. So fundamentally, social justice doesn't take into account an afterlife, a system of rewards and punishments. In fact, they think that you got to punish everyone now, and if someone gets away with it, that's the worst thing ever.
Right.
So it's Karl Marx, of course, was atheistic. You have Jean-Jacques Rousseau was raised Calvinist, but he very much veered from that. And when you look at different iterations of social justice, though, you'll see varying degrees of religious involvement. So like Walter Rauschenbusch, who helped make the term social justice popular, was a Baptist professor, and he wanted to wed socialism with Christianity. And you see this in liberation theology in the Catholic Church, that Black liberation theology in our context more. There's they try to take Christianity and wed it to Marxism or socialism. In every case, though, the Marxism ends up eating the Christianity. You don't really have Christianity anymore.
It seems like it's true that the foundational beliefs of Christianity would be like a direct clash to the social justice movement. Because when you look at the idea of calling, especially when we're looking at it from the perspective of modern times, when we're looking at the family unit, when we're looking at what the Christian church, what Scripture calls sin, in particular homosexuality, the transgender movement, it seemed like that they would just come like in direct conflict with one another. So I always have trouble understanding why it is so many people get caught up. A lot of Christians get caught up in that movement. I'll let you just jump on that, and then I'll add on to it as you go.
Yeah, it is a difficult question, and I've spent a lot of time trying to answer it. And there's multiple, I think, answers because it's different for every person. But in general, there's a lot of people who are converts to social justice, whether they realize it or not. They've adopted the scheme. They have their own holy perspectives that are unquestioned, that are infallible. So you can't question a minority experience, let's say. They have their own implicit bias trainings, which is like their evangelism, and they have their saints. You could be the worst criminal ever, but if you died at the hands of the police, you become a saint. And so
George Floyd, for instance.
George Floyd, right, exactly. So I think people have adopted this scheme. They've been really inculcated with it through the media, through education, and sometimes through their church. And so this happens, like worldviews are more caught than taught. This happens kind of when you're not really paying attention, your guard's down.
Right.
And sooner or later, you've adopted this perspective, and you're not seeing how it contradicts with Christianity. And then in walks someone who tells you that this is in keeping with Christianity. And you can point to some parallels. That's why Francis Schaeffer called Marxism a Christian heresy, because Marxism has a belief, and this is a unique thing, that individuals actually have some kind of a worth. Now, you can say that's not how their systems actually work. They kill
Right.
people and they don't care. That's true. Ultimately, but theoretically, at a base level, that's how they hook you in. They tell you this respects human dignity. And not every political or social system actually believes that or starts in that place. Islam doesn't start there. So there's a sort of a humanist hook at the beginning of the process of, I think, converting into social justice. And there's a commonality somewhat between that and Christianity, because Christians also value the dignity of individuals, and Christians
Right.
also want to help people, right? A lot of the things that they say on the front end sound really good. The contradictions, of course, as you just rightly pointed out, come in when you start looking at Christianity's teachings on hierarchy and natural order, and then what social justice teaches on hierarchy and natural order,
Right.
and gender now, um, and and then even things like providence, and how social justice thinks the world actually operates according to privilege and power, and Christianity, which says actually things are in the hands of God and God's directing things towards a
Amen.
certain end. So you start seeing all these different contradictions the more you look into it, but the first foot forward that they lead with sounds kind of similar to Christianity. You can
Right.
there's sort of a sin thing out there, and we got to stop it. And once we do that, we'll enter this world where things are going to be a lot better. Sounds like a millennial kingdom almost, that Jesus is going to get. I mean, there's
Right.
enough there that I think Christians, especially in a post-Christian society, feel somewhat comfortable with it, because it's like
Yeah.
something that's reminiscent of maybe their parents' or grandparents' religion,
It
when it's actually
sounds
something
fair.
different.
Yeah, it sounds fair. It sounds right. It sounds like you're doing good, but the means by which you get there is oftentimes completely contrary to scripture.
Yes.
Would you agree with that? I remember reading a few years ago I was reading the Communist Manifesto, and then the opening chapters, I even posted on Facebook. I said, when you initially read some of the things that Marx wrote, it's like you can kind of understand where it would be attractive to some. While I was
Sure.
reading it, I was like, man, I could see. Not that I was buying into any of the nonsense, because I ultimately know where it leads, what path it leads down. But just as a layman reading, I can see how some people might initially say, "This doesn't sound bad. This doesn't sound like this great evil that everybody espouses communism to be." Which is why I would say, to some degree, why we're in the boat we're in right now, where it's where people here in the U.S. are more open to it, as far as I know, than in any time in our history.
We're ignorant. Yeah, that's part of the problem. But yeah, Karl Marx isn't starting off saying looting and gulags and death camps, and
Right.
he's starting off with, here's the dream, here's this society that, wouldn't you love to live in that? And you say, well, yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I'd like to live in a more equal society. That would be great. And it's, how do you get from A to B though? That's the problem. And really, even making that the goal is a problem, because you're never going to get there. And anyone who tells you that you can get there is lying to you, and they're going to take advantage of you. So I think that communists tend to be dreamers, and a
Mm-hmm.
lot of I don't think it's a mistake that a lot of the social justice warrior types tend to come from, like, even if you're on a university campus, they tend to be in these soft science fields. They tend to be in the arts. They tend to be people who are just very innovative, and
Yeah.
they can they can dream up a society, whether it's fanciful or not, that they would love to live in, and then say, well, why can't we just have that? And it's like, well, you're going to run up against nature and reality. That's why we can't have it. But they're dreamers. They're not thinking through that.
No, that's
So,
very true. I had a conversation with a family member just a few days ago, and not to sidetrack too much, but it's on a similar topic. We were talking about the issues of socialism. Socialism. He was sharing with me this video of a mine. I think I can't remember what metal it was. It's like one of the main metals that are needed, like in our phones and in the electric cars.
oh
And
yes,
it was on the Joe
I'm
Rogan. It was on the
yes,
Joe Rogan
I
show.
just saw that this morning. It's funny you bring that up. Yeah.
Yeah, he was sharing with me that video, and I said, "Yeah, man, that's pretty horrific." And my brother leans his theology is kind of a is a conversation in and of itself. I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
And he said that's capitalism. Like that was his first response was that's capitalism right there. And he says, I know you don't want to get into a debate on the phone because typically when he and I do, we kind of end up clashing a lot of times. So we kind of came to a agreement that if we get into any deep conversations, deep debates, we'll do it face to face because we tend to be
Wise.
more respectful and not to take each other out of context. But I pushed back and I said, that's not capitalism. And I said, because generally speaking, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not an expert on these topics, but capitalism primarily is like the fair exchange of goods and services. That's like a very simple explanation to my knowledge. And I said
market, yeah,
free market. And I said that what we have right there is basically slave labor. And if I'm not mistaken, that's what the actual author of the book, the guy who was reporting on this, said, is that this was a slave system. You have people down there working crazy hours. You have children down there working longer than they should. I said, that's not capitalism. And then we got into a debate. Why I brought that up was in regard to the idea of socialism when it comes to the perspective of socialism. Well, let me ask you this, and let me know if I'm venturing too far off, but socialism and this whole social justice issue, how do they I can't say how do they relate because you kind of went into that, but yeah, let me ask you, like, how big of a difference is there between social justice? Is it all the same? And the and socialism and in relation to communism, would you just say that they're just different wings of the same thing?
Sure.
I think you know where I'm going with that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think I totally understand what you're saying. It's a good question. Social justice, I view as it's an umbrella term that has different versions or iterations, different manifestations. And so socialism is a manifestation of social justice.
Right.
But you have, there's different versions of socialism. There's cultural Marxism, there's Fabian socialism, there's national socialism like the Nazis had, right? And so there's socialism that's inspired by Karl Marx. There's also versions of socialism that aren't inspired. The Nazis didn't like Karl Marx, but they were
really?
socialists. So
they weren't fans, but they still had similar ideologies. With that, is that
well,
what
they weren't fans
say?
of Marxism? Yeah, they weren't. Fans
I mean,
of
they
Marx.
weren't. Yeah, they weren't fans, but they had.
Right.
But at the same time,
the main area that they differed on was that the Marxists or the communists, the Bolsheviks of Russia, they had an international socialism, and the Nazis were national socialists. So that was their difference. Their major difference was the Nazis wanted to be German, and part of the Volk and people and place and was part of their system. We actually had something similar in our country at the turn of the not the last century, but the turn of the 20th century. We had something called Christian nationalism. Now, today's Christian nationalism is different, but it was called Christian nationalism. It was actually similar in some ways to National Socialism, and they believe that the government should be in control of healthcare and living wage and all these different things. But they thought that it was that they didn't have any class envy. They didn't think that they thought it was a unique to America. We should take care of our own in America. Whereas the communists tend to think, no, we want a globalist kind of empire where there aren't distinctions between nations. And that it never works out that way. That's the thing, because these are all theoretical things. Because when the boots meet the ground, the Russian communists are very pro-Russian. The Chinese communists are very pro-Chinese, right? The Cubans are very pro-Cuban. That's just human nature. So you
Hmm.
can't really escape that. But in theory, that's a big difference. So anyway, to just put a cap on it, social justice is an umbrella term that would involve those three elements that I brought up: the wanting equality, thinking there's institutions preventing it, and wanting to create a central authority to force equality to happen. That any iteration of that, any version of that, whether it's socialism or Marxism, different versions of Marxism, communism, critical theory, critical race theory, all of these are just different versions of those same three elements rearranged in
Right.
different ways, maybe more complicated. Like critical race theory is kind of complicated, but when you break it all down, it's the same thing. There's equality we want to get to, people are preventing it, let's take those people out.
Right.
So
So would you say that ultimately force would be involved in critical race theory, socialism,
oh,
all
there
these
has to be.
movements?
Yeah, there's
Okay.
no option but to have force. You have to have
So if
force
people
because
rebel against it in some way, shape, or form, and because I think I remember reading like might have been is it Marcuse? Is that his name?
Herbert Marcuse, yeah, Frankfurt
Yeah,
School.
I think he kind of spoke. He might have been more vocal about that aspect. Is that true? Would you say
Which aspect is that?
about force being
Oh,
a
force.
necessary part of
Yeah, well,
promoting this agenda?
he was against free speech. He wanted to. He did want the government to compel speech, and so that a lot of people trace political
He
correctness.
did. He
Yeah,
did want the government to compel speech. He did.
to
I'm just
control.
saying.
Yeah, to some extent. Yeah, he wanted the government involved in policing what we can say and what we can't say. Um, and so that's where political correctness, a lot of people say it came from Herbert Marcuse, because, and the funny thing was he wanted to do it for the sake of, it's weird these people can do this, but for the sake of greater freedom and equality, we're going to have to suppress your speech, right? And so I can't think. I don't specifically remember what kinds of things he wanted controlled, but I do remember that he did want speech controlled. And ultimately, though, whether it's Marcuse or Gramsci or any of the other members of the Frankfurt School or critical race theorists, they all really, at the end of the day, want the government or some central authority to come in and police our actions in some way. And it's for the purpose specifically of bringing about some kind of equity, diversity, inclusion agenda. So
Right.
the government, people aren't going to willingly give their money up. So the government has to come and take their money, or they're not going to willingly step down from a job, right, that they've earned. So the government has to put
Right.
in some kind of affirmative action or something to tip the scales. So yeah, inevitably there's going to be force somewhere. Otherwise, it doesn't work. I mean, ultimately, God is government in this scheme. The government becomes, you cry out to the government when
Mm,
there's a disaster, not to God, because the government will
mm.
save you.
Right, right. That makes a lot of sense because that's what we're seeing now. Even with movements like or organizations, I should say, like the World Economic Forum,
Yes.
yeah, they embody. It's almost like they're like almost the living embodiment of these principles, and they're trying to influence people to do the things that they want, and it comes off sounding nice and fair. That one term or saying that came real popular a few years ago: "You will own nothing and be happy." And
Yeah.
then they got a lot of pushback for it, they kind of scrubbed that from their website. But you see them promoting a lot of these similar
Well, it's
perspectives.
utopian. It's utopian.
Yes.
We can live in this world that never has existed, but we're going to, through our own innovation and achievement, build this Tower of Babel, and
Mm,
everyone's going to come together, and we're going to eliminate all the distinctions between people, and we're going to have peace finally. And it sounds so good, but it's obviously, for Christians who understand what's actually in store for the world, we know that that's not, doesn't comport with human nature, and it's not God's plan anyway. In fact, it's awfully similar to the Tower of Babel. It's awfully similar to what God said not to do. The thing about the World Economic Forum is they strike me as kind of like global fascists. They
hmm.
have, they're not your traditional communist types. They, you know, classic communists at least knew there were two genders, and like there were certain things that they they took into
Right.
account. I mean, these guys want transhumanism. They also seem to be fine with all these global corporations taking part in it, which isn't your
Mm-hmm.
classic communism. That's more
Yeah.
of a fascist thing where you have all these corporations that give you the illusion of freedom, but then a central body tells them what they can do and can't do, and ultimately has control. And so we're marching towards a global fascism or a globalist agenda, and it's totally social justice driven. It's totally religious too, and has a very
Oh, big time.
optimistic view of man.
Yeah, too optimistic, I would say. And that's where I think the clash comes in again when it comes to, if for those of us who have a biblical perspective, those of us who are Christian, it looks at man as being like too good, other than the what is it, the bourgeoisie. From
Yeah.
that perspective, like they're the ones who are evil. That's the evil. But like as far as the working class, they're good. It's like they're inherently good when it comes to socialism.
Well,
Or if you look at
even the bourgeoisie, though, there's an environmental factor that they're going to invoke. They'll say it's part of its systems. Sin is systemic. Racism, you hear
Mhm.
that a lot, is systemic.
Right.
That their whole focus is that these systems corrupt us and make us do these evil things.
Oh,
And so
okay.
like Jesus said that evil comes from within man. They don't believe that. They believe evil comes from without. So if you can correct all these
Wow.
systems, then the heart will take care of itself. Whereas we think the opposite as Christians. We think you correct the hearts and then the systems will take care of themselves. It's
Right.
more likely because the evil comes from the heart. So, so yeah, I mean, that's why they even say things like race is a social construct, gender is a social construct, because when I think from our perspective, this is very confusing because we're accustomed to thinking in terms of like, for instance, you're born a black man, I was born a white man, you're born a man, I'm born a man, you're born
Right.
there's certain things that we're just like, well, that's just how I was born. They come in though, and they'll say, well, not really. You are born a certain way, but you become part of these power dynamics as you gain influence and you grow. And so I'll use myself as the example, as being a white man, what that represents isn't a genetic component. It's not because my parents are white and I have genes that made me, look pasty and need sunscreen. It's because I am part of the thing that's significant is I'm part of a power dynamic where I have control and I have influence and privilege. And so in order to, what am I expected to do in order to get rid of my maleness and my whiteness and my heterosexuality? I have to somehow amend for it. I have to give up my privilege, right? I have to go and do penance somehow for this.
Mm.
And I have to vote the right way. That's the most important thing. And in so doing, I emancipate myself from the systemic evil,
Of
So it's
whiteness to some
right.
degree, especially in this example you're giving. Like you hear the term whiteness being used as a almost like a cuss word. I mean, it's like such a and when they speak about it, it's not. And correct me if I'm wrong. They're not necessarily talking about your skin color. They're
No,
talking
they're
about
not. Yeah,
they're
that's
talking
what I'm
about the
trying to say.
ideology. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, they're talking about something so much more broad than that. I mean, that's why they can say like Candace Owens or Bodie Bacham are, white supremacists, and that,
Hmm.
I mean, you hear this kind of stuff, and
Larry Elder.
Larry Elder, yeah, all the Uncle Tom type
Yeah,
people,
yeah, yeah.
they all get this marred with their white supremacists or self-hating black people or whatever. You see the same thing though with women who want to submit to their husbands and don't want to take the feminist agenda.
Hmm.
Suddenly they don't get the quality of being a woman anymore. They're just channels for patriarchy, and so people who are white males, if they go along with the woke agenda, if you notice, they don't get in trouble.
Oh
they
no.
they're able to navigate that, and as long as they're voting the right way and giving to the right causes, they're no longer white males apparently. So
Wow.
it's really for them, for the social justice warriors, everything is an abstraction, and they look at the world kind of like, if you've seen the movie The Matrix, like it's a bunch of ones
Yes.
and zeros, and you have oppressors and oppressed, and that's all you have. I mean, and we know as Christians the world's much more complicated than this,
No
but they've
doubt.
reduced everything down to those two things. And so based on your activism or your activity, they can determine where you fit, whether or not you are an oppressor or an oppressed person. And things like skin color and gender and these things that God created us, those things become they become less rooted in reality and more just I guess, for lack of a better phrase, they signify a level of power that you have, and you have the choice to get rid of that power or to try to acquire power. And so it can be terribly confusing for someone who's accustomed to thinking in real world terms, like most of us. But this is what youngins, from a young age, are learning in
Right.
school, and so it's very sad to me.
Yeah, big time. Which brings me, because once again, I want to respect your time, which brings me to my last question. When you reference school, so I'll just put in more of in one question. How does the believer or the person who has a more of a conservative mindset, with this infecting almost every area of our modern society? I mean, it's in the school system, it's in our entertainment, it's in sports. Like, I used to be one of the biggest NBA fans that you could name. I watched basketball Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Sundays. I was always watching basketball. But after 2020, after the whole George Floyd thing went down, and they were putting BLM on the courts and wearing BLM on their shirts, and based off of a lie with people like Rayshard Brooks and all the other exaggerations that BLM promoted and people just fell for. I just said, I'm done. I'm done with basketball. I stopped watching. But in light of the fact that it has impacted or influenced basically every aspect of our society, how does one navigate nowadays, and how should we respond? Those of us who want to stand fast, who might be a little intimidated by what's going on, how would you suggest we respond in light of what's happening to our society?
I think the same way that a Christian living in Utah under Mormonism would behave, or a Christian living in the Middle East under Islam would behave. You just have to recognize you live in hostile territory. There's another religion that is controlling things, and
Right.
it's going to affect every institution. And so if you send your kids to school in Utah, you're probably prepared that they're going to get some Mormonism. So you want to try to inoculate them against that by teaching them the truth about Mormonism and the truth
Right.
about, giving them the tools to handle it, letting them know what God's word says. So that it's really a simple formula. It's just trust and obey. It's just living in a way that's smart and using some common sense, I think. But I think the thing that we're still getting over, because we have some whiplash perhaps, is the fact that we weren't this way. We weren't thoroughly saturated with social justice thinking, and now we are. So we remember a time when we weren't in our country, and now we are.
Exactly.
And so we're still, I think, surprised. I know I'm surprised sometimes when I see it pop. I mean,
Oh,
right
yeah.
down the street, they created this mural. I live in a small town. It's Apple Country. And in my area, I don't see LGBT flags or any of that. Well, the local high school did a whole mural down the street from me, and it's got two lesbians, and it's got a farmer on a tractor with a rainbow flag on his overalls,
Wow.
which is, totally unrealistic. But this is the next generation here.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I was surprised. I was mad about it when I first saw it. I was just like, how can this be? And it just was a reminder. I'm like, okay, I'm living in hostile territory, and I have to just recognize that and adjust accordingly, and never back down. Be okay with being called names, because they're going to call you every name under the book for opposing it. But we just have to be okay with that, because Jesus said that if they persecute you on the account of me, to rejoice and be exceedingly glad. And so that's what I try to do. It's hard sometimes, but
Oh, yeah.
but that's what we have to get used to doing, is just thinking about Jesus and not the approval of men. And men are fickle, right now it's social justice and, the versions of social justice that are popular, but in 20 years and 30 years, who knows what the fad's going to be. Right. And the thing that doesn't change is the word of God. So
Amen.
Stay true to the word of God.
Amen. Amen. I can recall a few years ago when I was deployed to Operation Desert Storm. Not a few years ago. talking about early
I was
90s.
gonna say I was a baby.
Time flies, man. Tell me, trust me, time flies. Before you know it, you'll be in my boat over here, probably
Yeah.
saying some of the same thing. But I can recall coming back from Operation Desert Storm and having parades in the street, which 30 years prior to that, 20 some years prior to that, the soldiers coming back from Vietnam saw something totally different.
Yeah.
They were being spit on. And it was like our society at that time went above and beyond not to be like that. And I tell people it wasn't that long ago where you had shows on TV like the Man Show, where they would have, part of the show was women on trampolines, jumping up and
Yes.
down wearing
Jimmy Kimmel.
bikinis.
Yeah.
But nowadays, like, that would never make it to TV. And it just, I mentioned those because it just shows how quick a shift the culture can have.
And those
It's
are
a
two
little
positive shifts.
yes, but then that positive shift went to the extreme. Like, nowadays, you can't say anything that's even considered remotely questionable that might hurt somebody's feelings. They went from making fun of people on TV, like Howard Stern went from having Crackhead Bob on his show to nowadays the guy is all about the vaccine, and he's just like this raving lunatic, saying people who didn't get the vaccine should be locked up. It just shows the extremes people go through. It just shows the extremes our society, my main point is how quickly a society can shift. And I would say that a society that doesn't stand on the word of God as its foundation, as Jesus said in John and Matthew 7, as far as the sinking sand, like, you're on nothing. And you're bound to shift as the culture shifts. You don't have any true solid foundations of your own. So whatever society tells you, whatever Hollywood says is popular or the right way to go, okay, then that's the path I'll go down. So I think,
100 years ago, we were enamored in this country with scientific racism and eugenics and all of that. And of course, I think the defeat of the Nazis ended up kind of taking a lot of the winds out of those sails. But
big time.
Today, of course, and that I could even make the argument some of that was an earlier iteration of social justice in certain ways. But today's versions of social justice would, of course, they're trying to cancel that, and it's. That's within what, 3 lifetimes that we've gotten to it doesn't take that long. And people pointed out that even the crowds with Jesus, they were following him. And then all of a sudden they shout and crucify him. Like, didn't take it but a couple weeks or days. So
no, big
people
time.
are fickle.
Big time. Well, Jon, I appreciate having you on, my man. You've been a wealth of knowledge as always. Once again, where can my listeners follow you if they found your content, your information helpful? Where are some of the places that you kind of frequent on social media or your website or anything like that?
They can go to worldviewconversation.com and you'll find my social media links. Right now, I'm promoting a documentary that we're working on this next year called the 1607 Project. You can go to 1607project.com and check that out. And then
what's that about? If you don't mind me asking,
it's an answer to the 1619 Project.
Oh, excellent.
We're doing. Obviously, there's been there's examples of racism, and every country has their warts and their things in their past that aren't good. But the problem with 1619, of course, is they make that fundamentally the definition of what America is, and it's just in every institution and still affecting us in every way. And 1607 is a response to really give a more full picture of what America really is and what makes us unique and what makes America a wonderful place. Because I still think it's a wonderful place.
Me too.
Yeah, I don't like to see some of these changes, but so we're trying to prevent some. We're trying to give a resource to especially homeschoolers, maybe some Christian school folks. I doubt any public schools would use it to educate children and high schoolers especially on what makes America a place worth being proud to be in. And so that's at 1607project.com. You can also...
When is that expected to be finished? Are you guys still funding and trying to raise money right now?
Yeah, we're still raising money for it. There's a little trailer there that explains kind of what it's about. It's probably, realistically, I think it should be finished in the summer. We intended to have it done in the spring, but I just don't think that's going to happen. I think realistically it'll probably be July or August. And then the other place people can go is the laststandstudios.org if they want to check out some of the other documentaries that I've helped produce. And Paint the Wall Black is there. I think you've probably seen that. And
oh, excellent. Excellent documentary, man. I watched that with my whole family, man. That was very
did you? Good.
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
Very good.
So.
Anything else? Is that pretty much it as far as where
those are the 3 websites. So.
And your books again, what were the title of those books? I'll put some of these links. I'll put the links down in the show notes or description.
You can go to worldviewconversation.com. The books are there. You can get autographed copies. But if you go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble, it's Social Justice Goes to Church and Christianity and Social Justice. Those are the 2 titles.
Awesome. All right. Well, once again, Jon, thank you again for being here. Everyone else, Eric. Hey, you're very welcome, brother. I'll probably bring you on. I wanted to ask a few questions, and I know it would have taken us down. I wanted to ask a few additional questions, but I'm pretty sure it would have taken us down a completely different rabbit hole. So I'll probably have you on, Lord willing, down the road to deal with certain issues. Like when you talk about fascism, that's something that's thrown out a lot, but oftentimes it isn't defined. So I would love to invite you on down the road to discuss maybe just that simple topic, like what is fascism, and as far as what people know it to be, and what is it in all actuality.
Yeah.
But once again, brother, thank you for joining me. To everyone else, as always, stay safe, God bless, and make sure you join the conversation.
Thanks, Eric.